I'll start webinar. Good luck, Kathy.
Thanks, Alan. Do you see anybody popping in?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep, we're good.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming early. We're just going to wait for probably until 7:01 or 7:02 to start the webinar. But we appreciate all your early birds. Me and Alan are early birds too. Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait for a little bit longer. It is 6:59. We'll probably start the webinar at 7:01. I see you folks are chatting in our chat box and saying hello to everybody. We'll go through kind of the agenda and everything at 7:01. So I'll put myself on mute and we'll start then. All right, so it is 7:00. So we'll just go through some of the intro really quickly while we're waiting for other people to start coming or jumping into our webinar. Just so everyone knows, this seminar will be recorded. It will take a couple of days for it to be posted to our YouTube channel, but I'll make sure to send that link out to everyone. Additionally, I will send out the PowerPoint to everyone so that way you can have access to our slides after this event. Along with the PowerPoint, I'll send you a link to our evaluation of the webinar. So any feedback that you can provide us would be super beneficial. This is a webinar format, and so if you have any questions regarding composting, we have a break in the middle of our slideshow, and we can answer any of your questions that you post either in the Q&A or in the chat function. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce our host that we have here, Alan Pultanevich, who is our recycling coordinator. He will be the person moderating the chat and adding information for some of the polling questions that we'll be doing.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, Alan. So my name is Kathy Vasquez. I am the Commercial Food Scraps Program Manager for the Department of Environmental Protection, Recycling and Resource Management Division in the Waste Reduction and Recycling section. It is a very long name, but I am very excited to have everyone here tonight to talk about this really exciting project that we are starting here in Montgomery County. So hopefully everyone can see my slideshows. If anyone can't, just write that in the chat so that way we can address it. But so the reason why we're doing this project is really because of this 2018 strategic plan to advance composting and compost use and food scraps diversion in Montgomery County. So this report was developed back in 2018, and it has a lot of recommendations that we are currently implementing and have been implementing over the last 2 years. The residential backyard food scrap composting program was one of the recommendations in the strategic plan, and we're so excited to start a project that is going to be able to provide guidance and resources to all of the Montgomery County residents through this project. Before we jump into all of the everything else, I just want to go over kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So one of the things we're going to be talking about is why we're doing the project, which I've gotten a lot of emails from people about that. So I want to make sure we touch upon that. What are the expectations from our resident volunteers? We're so happy that you're volunteering. But as a resident, we are asking you to do a couple of different things so that way we can develop a really robust backyard food scrap composting program in Montgomery County. And then we'll go into the basics of how to compost. In that portion, not only will we talk about the basics of composting, we will also kind of give you best management practices for tumblers, and additionally for the static compost bin that you currently may have. So before we talk about all of that, I want to know a little bit about you. So we have a poll question right here. And so if you can answer it, what is your composting experience? Would you consider yourself a beginner, an intermediate composter, or an advanced composter? And I'll give you a couple of seconds so you folks can answer. So Alan, I don't know if you want to stop the poll and then we can share the results. Great, so hopefully you folks can see that. So it looks like we have a very good mix of different types of composters on this call, which is fantastic. So hopefully for the beginner composters, we'll be able to provide you with enough information so you feel comfortable using the compost bin that you currently have. If you're an intermediate composter and only composting leaves and grass, congratulations on moving up to food scraps. This is a really exciting part, and it'll make it very easy for you to kind of go from start actually creating more compost when you add your food waste in it, because it'll speed up your compost bins. And then for those of you who are advanced, thank you for joining. Hopefully I can give you some nuggets of wisdom, and then hopefully you'll be able to provide some guidance as well to some of the people in the chat. And I appreciate all of you coming today. So we talked a little bit about the strategic plan, and an additional part of this is what we're trying to do. One of our mottos is, to reduce more and recycle, or reduce waste and recycle more, aiming for zero waste. And a big part of that is getting food scraps out of the waste stream. We did a waste composition study in 2017. And one of the things that we found out was that single family homes actually dispose of about 40,000 tons of food waste annually in Montgomery County. That equals to about 80 million pounds of food scraps. So what you folks are helping us do is trying to get some of that food waste out of our waste stream, so that way we can turn it into a product that can be used locally in your gardens and for your trees that are on your property. So why do we need use? So like I said, this is a new program, and we have over 450 resident volunteers who are helping us out. The big thing that we're doing is we're trying to test whether or not compost bins that we provided to you will be rodent proof. And the reason that is because in our current solid waste regulations in Chapter 48, it is required by our regulation that a bin can be rodent proof. So what you're doing by helping us in this project is giving us real data and real information. So as we try to expand this project so other Montgomery County residents can participate, we can give them real information and say, yes, we tested this out. We've had residents volunteers this, they've used these bins, and this is why they work well. So your feedback is critical to this program. So what will you be doing? I know I had a lot of emails about this. So you'll be weighing your food scraps, and you only have to weigh your food scraps. You don't have to weigh the brown materials that you're putting into your bins. You'll be adding those materials into one of the two bins that you received, whether that's the tumbler or the earth machine, and you'll be adding brown material into it as well. And then what you'll be doing is you'll send us a data sheet with that information on a monthly basis. We're hoping to get at least 2 to 3 months for us to do some evaluation on how these bins are performing. Additionally, we did provide you with a compost thermometer, and that will help you figure out if you're composting, if you're hot composting, and it'll help us kind of troubleshoot if you're having problems in your compost bin. So that's why those are provided. If at any point in time you're experiencing any problems with composting in these bins, please reach out to us so that way we can help you troubleshoot and make sure that you get back onto the right path. So now we're going to jump into all of the good information on how to compost. So what is composting? Composting is just the decomposition of organic materials, and then when it's broken down, it gets turned into a stable soil amendment called humus. So compost and humus are interchangeable. Compost is usually, we call that stable soil amendment compost when it's humans that are making it, and when it naturally occurs in the environment, it's what we call humus. Compost is going to happen no matter what. So no worries about doing something poorly or not knowing enough. It's going to break down, because what you're doing is you're trying to create the best environment, so that way those materials get broken down the fastest. But if it doesn't get broken down the fastest, it will break down eventually. That's the great thing about compost. You really, there's a rough guideline of how to do it, but you can't really, once you stick to those guidelines, you can't really go wrong. And like I said before, composting is when humans are actually helping to speed up that decomposition process, so that way we can get that black gold at the end a little bit faster, so we can help our fruits and vegetable plants throughout the summer, or some of our perennial plants that we have over the winter. So there's a basic equation that we use when we're talking about composting, and hopefully this will help you kind of wrap your head around what materials need to go into a bin. So there's brown materials. So those are going to be your dead, dry, brown materials. Those are things like leaves and twigs and branches, dried grass, things of that nature. Then there's going to be your green materials. Normally, when we're talking about composting in Montgomery County, we only talk about our yard trim materials that are green. But with this program, you're going to be including a bunch of different food scraps, and those are going to be considered your greens as well. Greens are high in nitrogen. They're going to be wet, and they're going to look more alive than the brown material. You're going to want air. Air is very important, so that way you don't get any odors in your compost bin. And we'll talk about ways to increase air circulation. And then additionally, you're going to want water. Like I said, composting is about making a really good ecosystem for the organisms that are in your bin. Like us, all of the organisms that are in your bin are going to need air and water for them to function well. And there are specific requirements that they need to make sure that you're producing, or you're going in an anaerobic or high oxygen environment. And then with all those different things, you're going to make some compost. So what are the organisms that are producing the compost, or helping produce the compost? So there is a specific compost food chain. So all of these organisms are going to be in your bin at one point in time or another. Usually when we talk about composting, we talk about hot and cold composting. Hot just means that you're skewing it so that way beneficial microbacteria are doing the work. So they're tiny organisms that are doing the work, and it gets very hot. When you're talking about cold composting, you're skewing your compost bin so that way bigger organisms like springtails or worms or any of those items are doing the work. I've had a lot of questions of people ask me, do I need to add these organisms into my bin? You do not. The great thing about composting is that if you build it, they will come. If you have all the right materials, if you have the right browns and greens in the right mix, if you put in the right amount of water, and additionally, if you have good airflow, all these materials will come, all these organisms will come to your bin no matter what. They're already on the food scraps that you're putting in. They're already on the brown materials that you're putting in. So they will love it because you're building them a nice little home for them to survive. So how do we make those organisms thrive? We kind of talked about it a little bit, but let's really dive into a little bit more. So we want to make sure that all of those organisms have food, and that means you have a good mix of browns and greens. Additionally, you want to make sure that they have enough air. A good compost pile is going to have aeration, and this will help keep all those organisms alive and help it stay aerobic in decomposition. And then you're gonna want good amount of water. You want your pile wet but not soaking. The moisture in your pile will help those tiny organisms, those beneficial bacteria, move around a lot bigger because they actually need that water layer or that water seal that's on that will develop so that they can move all throughout the bin. So for this program, and which is great. So there's a bunch of different acceptable materials that you can add into your backyard bin that are food scraps. This breaks down into your nitrogen-rich materials and your carbon-rich materials. You should have also additionally have gotten a tip sheet that has this information as well and dives into this, the browns and greens a little bit more. So when we talk about green materials, we're talking about things that are nitrogen-rich. They're fresh and moist. They're going to have a lot of moisture, and those are going to be any fruits and vegetable scraps, plant trimmings, grass, flour, any green prunings, coffee grounds and filters, fresh hay, tea bags, and loose tea. The other part, the brown materials or the carbon-rich materials, are everything that's dead and dry. And those can be eggshells, breads and pastas, nuts and nut shells, food soil paper and napkins, dry leaves and twigs, wood chips, straw, cotton rags, dry lint, and cooled wood ash. I got a couple of questions in my email this week about bread and pasta, right? Some people were concerned that if you add bread and pasta into your compost bin, that you're gonna attract pests. So in my experience, when you're adding, the amount of material that you're adding for bread and pasta is usually so tiny that it's not going to attract any pests. Additionally, the breads and pastas tend to be really high in carbohydrates and sugars, and microorganisms are going to want to eat that really quick because it's super tasty food for them, so it breaks down really fast. In my experience, when I've added those things into a compost bin, it usually breaks down in 3 to 4 days, so it's pretty fast. What are exactly examples of what to compost? So when we talk about fruits and vegetables, we're talking about vegetables and their trimmings. So that means anything that's like the peel, the carrot tops, your avocado pits, all those are fine. Fruit cores and peels are completely fine to add into these compost bins. Coffee grounds and filters, tea bags, and loose tea. So the filters are fine, coffee grounds are fine. The tea bags, just make sure that they're made out of paper. There are some companies that are currently making tea bags that are plastic. You'll find out within the first, if you put them into your bin, you'll find out within the first couple of days whether or not those materials are that can't be composted. Like I said, bread and pasta, nuts and nutshells, that's completely fine. Eggshells. So we get a lot of questions about eggshells. Eggshells will take a very long time to decompose, but if you don't mind having the little specks in your finished compost of white eggshells, when you add it to your garden beds or to any part of your lawn, then you shouldn't have a problem. The eggshells are great because they do provide calcium for a lot of plants as they're breaking down in the soil. And then talk about food soil paper and paper towels. So what are some things, let me just go back really quickly. I've gotten some questions over email also about how do I store this material, right? So there are a lot of different ways that you can store this. You can, if you wanted to, you can go out and buy a kitchen pail, which is a kitchen caddy that you can have on your countertop, and it'll make it easy for you to put the materials in. Some of them have that carbon filter that's in there that helps deal with odors. I recommend reusing some of the plastic items that you have around your house, such as yogurt containers are great just for storing food scraps, clean and emptied yogurt containers. Any of those clear salad containers are also great for storing food scraps for a long period of time. I was able to fit about 7 pounds of food scrap in one of those containers. So it holds quite a bit. And if you have any old Ziplocs, that's also a great way. If you're concerned about smells, old Ziplocs are great because you can put the food scraps in there and then throw it into your freezer. And then when you know that you're going to add materials into your food scrap, your compost bin, you can pull it out, thaw it out, and then add it into your compost bin. And if you think that you're going to be producing a whole lot of food scraps, you can go to a neighborhood deli or supermarket and see if they have any old pickle buckets. They have the old 5-gallon pickle buckets, and they'll be able to give that to you for free with a lid. And it's a great way to store your materials, and then you can transport it out of your compost bin. So what are some materials that you shouldn't put into your bin? Unlike curbside pickup of food scraps, we can't add these materials because it's in your small backyard. It can cause problems. So the materials that would cause problems are like anything that's dairy products, so like butter, eggs, milk, sour cream, yogurt, etc. Any diseased or insect-ridden plants, we recommend not adding that into your compost bin. Anything that has excessive fats, grease, lards, or oils, anything that's meat or fish bones and scraps, and then any pet waste. These are things that if you add to your compost bin can not only lead to pest issues, but can also make your bin go anaerobic, and then you'll get a lot more odors in your bin. When thinking about compost materials and the ease of composting food scraps or any materials, there's a ladder that I like to tell people. As you go up this ladder, it becomes a little bit more difficult to manage the materials. So you can think about it if you want to start with the easiest stuff first. You want to start with the yard and garden trimmings. Yard and garden trimmings are the easiest things to compost. It'll lead to the least amount of issues in your backyard. After that, you can start adding fruits and vegetable scraps. And then after that, add cooked vegetable scraps. And then on the top of that, you can add your bread, pastas, and grains. So as you go up this ladder, it just means that you have to manage your bin a little bit more. You have to pay attention to the mix that you're putting in and making sure that it has enough browns in there so your system doesn't go low oxygen or anaerobic. So we will stop here. And I see there's a lot of questions in the chat. So does anyone have any questions about what materials you can add to your compost pile?
So Kathy, I think what we can do is go through some of the chat questions first. Does that work for you?
That works for me.
Great, because we do have a lot of conversations happening on the chat. So thanks for everyone who has been putting in questions and comments into the chat. So let me just get to a good place where I can start. And there might be some back and forth, so I do apologize for that in no particular order. But I know there was some comment regarding dryer lint and microplastics in the dryer lint, and if it's synthetic clothes, things like that. So Kathy, if you can address dryer lint.
Sure. Yes, there are microplastics in dryer lint. And if you feel that the majority of your clothing are synthetic, then I would recommend not adding that material into your bin. If you're in doubt, leave it out. There are, I guess, plastic lint attractors that you can add to your not your compost bin, but to your dryer that actually will hold on to all the lint, and that'll make it easier for you to identify what is coming from like the plastics or what is coming from the materials that are just cottons or natural fibers that are in your dryer. So my recommendation is if you know that you have things that are high in acrylic or in synthetic fabrics, just leave those materials out and then just put that into your regular waste stream or your trash.
Kathy, there was a question regarding straw. The comment was, I thought the straw carried seed heads. Can you address straw?
Yes. So straw can have seed heads in it. It depends on where you're picking up your straw. If you are concerned that your straw has a lot of seed in it and you don't want to add that seed into your garden beds at the end, one of the things that I would recommend is when you're curing your compost, or at the end when you have finished compost, just leave your compost out in the sun for 1 to 2 weeks, and all of that straw and any other weed seeds will actually sprout and then die off. And then you can add that compost into your bin without worrying about any weed seeds or spreading any of those seeds to any of your garden beds that you have.
Kathy, there was a question about cooked or uncooked pasta, and then also some threads regarding if oil or spaghetti sauce on that, if you can address the pastas.
Yes. So hopefully you're not like putting in a 10-course pasta meal into your compost bin. Hopefully you will eat that because that is delicious. But the small amount of oil that is on your pasta, the small amount of the oil that's on any grains or barley that you may have, is not going to cause an issue in your compost bin. I would say that if you know that you have a whole pot of rice, which is, I would say, like 2 to 3 cups, or a whole pot, like a whole pound of pasta that went bad, I would say add that in small pieces into your compost bin to not cause any problems. Anytime you add too much of those items, you can cause things to become anaerobic in your bin. The pasta sauce is completely fine. It's tomato based, and it'll break down very fast.
Okay. Another question regarding wood ash. How much wood ash can you add?
Everything in moderation. So anytime, if you just had a fire, you can add that material in one, at every single time you're adding material. But if you've been holding on to that material for many, many weeks, I would just say add it in moderation into your bin.
Okay. There was also some questions regarding soil, and then along those lines also a compost accelerator.
So like I said in the beginning, if compost is going to happen no matter what. There are a lot of things on the market like compost accelerators or compost teas, or adding soil or finished compost into your bin. Some people, I would say, try it out and see if it works for you. In my experience, it has not ever been necessary to add any of those things to the compost pile, because like I said, the organisms that are doing the work to break it down are already living on the materials that you're adding into your bin. So adding an additional thing like an accelerator, or finished soil, or finished compost or soil, is not going to speed it up in my experience.
Okay. What about seeds in green peppers?
Seeds and green peppers. So just so everyone knows, I come from a community garden background. I used to work in New York City for 5 years at community gardens. So seeds and peppers, pumpkin seeds, all those big seeds are completely fine. The bigger the seed, though, the longer it's going to take to break down. So you'll just see that seed more often in your compost pile as it's breaking down, but it will eventually break down. Everyone has always had concerns about like avocado pits or mango pits. Avocado pits will break down really fast. Mango pits will take a little bit longer because their the outside shell of their seed is really fibrous, so it just takes a little bit longer to break down, but it will eventually break down.
Okay. What about staples from tea bags? Do they cause a problem?
No, staples from tea bags don't cause a problem. They'll as you're adding those things to your compost, your compost bin, it is not going to cause a problem to anything. If you wanted to remove them for aesthetic reasons, you can, but it's not going to cause any issues to the organisms that are in your compost pile.
Kathy, there was also some chat feature questions about citrus and peels. Does that?
Oh, so yeah, citrus and peels. So I get this question a lot when people are talking about worm bins as well. Citrus is completely fine to add into your compost pile, whether that's orange peels or pine. People are concerned about things that are acidic. what'll happen is the bacteria will break those things down first, and then make it nice and goopy. And then all the secondary decomposers will come in. So you'll see the millipedes and the worms and everything else eat that, because the bacteria will actually help change the acidity for other organisms to eat.
Okay. And a lot of great questions and information regarding what can go into the bin. And I know we have a limited time this evening. So what we will do is I have another thing for Kathy, but then if we don't get to your question, we can definitely follow up and get those questions answered. So if we don't get all the questions answered this evening, we will make sure that information is provided when we get out that information to everyone. But a question about adding chicken manure.
Chicken manure. Okay. Yes. So as you all of you should have gotten your compost bin already. If you haven't, you'll be getting it by Sunday. My recommendation when talking about any types of manures, especially chicken, is to have or set up a geobin specifically just for chicken manure. Since you're going to be actively managing your food scrap compost pile, you don't really want to consistently interact with that chicken manure all the time when it's in that pile. Like I said before, I used to work with community gardens in the Bronx. There's a lot of chickens in the Bronx in New York City, surprisingly, and that's the best way to kind of deal with chicken manure. It'll get hot really fast, which is great, but it's best to kind of let it cure and break down on its own.
And then, Kathy, I guess just two other ones. Sawdust, can sawdust be used? And then also, someone made a comment about adding fish bones as a great addition to the compost, but can chicken bones be added? And then the other question is really more for the measuring of the temperature, the process itself that we'll cover later on. So
yeah, so we'll dive into the process a little bit later. I know a lot of gardeners use fish meal on their garden as a good source of nitrogen. For this program, we're not recommending people add anything that has meats and bones into these compost piles, because it can cause issues, and we're trying to test these bins in an ideal situation so that we can have a good understanding of how these bins function, just with fruits and vegetable scraps. For sawdust, my only concern with sawdust is making sure that you're using sawdust from wood that is untreated. If you use treated wood, those treated wood has chemicals on it that could be not great for growing plants, and we don't want to incorporate that into or have that as something that's available for plants to uptake. So if you're using sawdust, just make sure it's coming from things that are untreated or unvarnished. Great. So thank you for all your questions. Now I have a question for you. So here's poll question number 2. Alan, if you can pop that up. So based on your experience, how long does it take to make finished compost? Is it 4 weeks, 1 to 2 months, 3 to 6 months, more than a year? So we'll wait a little while longer while people answer. All right, Alan, if you want to show the poll. Oh my goodness. All right, so the majority of you got it right, about 3 to 6 months if you're actively managing your pile. Especially when you're doing food scraps. That's the great thing about food scraps. Food scraps are adding a lot of moisture into your pile, so it helps speeds up the decomposition of your materials a lot faster. If you're only doing yard trim, you may experience the longer length, which is 3 to 9 months, or 6 to 9 months, or more than a year, because yard trimmings tend to be very low in moisture and just take a lot more time to break down. You can speed up decomposition if you are really crazy about composting. You can get compost in 2 months, but it would require a lot of management on your end, just a lot of time and taking care of the bin. So let's talk about how to actually compost food scraps. the one thing is you're going to chop everything into smaller pieces. Like I said earlier, we're trying to build an environment for all of these organisms, whether they're small or big, to thrive. Chopping it helps speed up the decomposition process, and it helps expose new areas for it to decompose faster. You're going to want to add your browns and green materials to your backyard bin, and we'll talk more about this later, but we are recommending a 2-to-1 by volume, which means just 2 browns to 1 green, but we'll talk about what that actually means a little bit later. You want to mix your materials together. So whether you're using a tumbler and you're physically turning the bin, or you're, mixing the materials inside of the earth machine or the static bin that you got, that's the best management practice. The other way that you can do this, you can do layers in your bin if you wanted to, lasagna layers of compost. So that would just be, having your your browns and then adding your greens. But if you wanted to have the speediest and make compost the fastest, mixing your browns and greens together is the best way to go. You're going to want to keep your pile moist by either adding more greens or adding water. We always recommend, use rainwater, but adding greens is a good way to add moisture to your pile. And there should be no exposed food scraps. So me and Alan were to go around and check out these compost bins. Hopefully when we open them up, they don't look like this picture to the left. And we're going to talk about what you should be doing a little bit. So, but anytime you're adding compost, your food scraps to your compost bin, you want to make sure that you add a layer of browns on top to help with maintaining the moisture in your pile, to help with keeping pests out and to keep odors out. So with composting, like I said, size matters. You want to make sure that you're cutting things about to the size of your hand, so that's 5 to 6 inches. And it helps decrease the surface material or surface area, so that way you have more area for the decomposers to eat that stuff. There it says that. You can go to chop happy. I've talked to composters that chop things really, really tiny, like 1 inch, because they're so happy and they want to try to get the composting to go as fast as possible. But if you chop things too small, what'll happen is you will decrease the air circulation in your bin. So we always recommend just chopping everything about 4 to 6 inches, or the size of your hand, to make sure that it's you have space in your bin for air to flow through all the materials that you're adding. So managing your browns and greens. So you're going to be adding browns and greens materials. So browns are all the things that we talked about, the dead, dry, carbon-rich browns that are going to be your leaves, your garden trimmings, anything that branches, twigs, all that material. And then your green materials are going to be any of your food scraps, any of your grasses, anything that has a lot of moisture in it, your coffee grounds, your tea bags. And you're going to be doing it in a 2-to-1 by volume. You're going to mix your browns and greens together and add them to your bin. So when we talk about volume, we're talking about 2 buckets of browns to 1 bucket of greens. This is really important especially for the tumblers, because you folks have a smaller capacity. You only have about 43 gallons of space to work with. So we want to make sure that you're keeping to these ratios, so that way you don't run out of space in your tumblers. How much water should you be adding to your bin? You want to keep it moist, but wet, but not dripping. So the optimal moisture content is between 50 to 60%, which really is the moisture of a wrung out sponge or a run out rag. So it shouldn't be dripping. If you go to your compost pile, if you add materials into your pile and you come back in a couple of days and you pick up the mix that you've put into there and it's very soggy, one of the things that you can do is you can add more browns to help deal with the moisture content. You can mix up the bin using a pitchfork, or you can use if you're using a tumbler, you can just turn it to make sure that all of the browns are in contact with some of the green material in there. Because what'll happen if you have too much moisture, it's going to slow down decomposition, and some of the organisms that you're trying to grow in there can drown. If it's too dry, it's going to slow down your composition as well, decomposition, because you're not going to have enough bacterial growth in there. It's going to really rely on the larger organisms like your worms and your sow bugs to do that work of breaking stuff down. And they take just a lot longer because they have to chop everything with their mouths. So it just takes a lot longer. So materials contain extra moisture, like I said. So nitrogen can be very wet, and you can add just nitrogen-rich materials into your bin in order to increase the amount of moisture in there. And if you have too much moisture, you can just add some more carbon-rich materials, so that way you can dry it down. So on top of water, the other super important thing is air. So oxygen is required for proper composting, because just like us, all those organisms in the pile and the organisms that you want to kind of foster and develop and help have a really great environment for are going to require oxygen. During composting, a lot of oxygen is consumed. So that's why we always recommend that people either mix or turn the pile, so that way you are increasing the oxygen or helping expose more areas in your bin to oxygen to help those organisms that are in there. If there's not enough oxygen, the bin is going to be turned anaerobic. Anaerobic just means low oxygen, and then it's going to slow down your composting, and you can actually develop an odor. So like I said, to increase, you can either mix or turn the pile. You can use a pitchfork or a shovel. You can poke the pile. There are things called wing dingers, which are a compost tool, or a compost. There's a compost corkscrew that actually will help turn the pile. Or you can just add more bulky brown material. So when I talk about bulky brown material, I'm talking about things that have more structure in them. So those are like branches and twigs, and that'll help increase the oxygen because they'll create spaces in your compost bin. And then on top of that, you may want to check the temperature. So in decomposition, it's going to produce heat. So like I said, what you're doing in your compost pile is you're trying to create the best environment for all these organisms to live. If the organisms in there are super happy, they're going to create heat because you've created the perfect party for them to hang out in. So temperature is going to be affected by a couple of different things. It's going to be moisture content, all things we've already talked about, the airflow, whether or not you have a really good carbon nitrogen ratio or browns to green ratio, and the size of the pile. You're going to want to make sure if you're aiming for hot composting that the ideal temperature is going to be between 104 to 122 for at least 5 days. So when you're taking the temperature of your pile, it's not going to be when you add your food scraps in. You're going to be taking the temperature of your pile. It's not going to be the first time you add your food scraps in. It's going to be when you go back and try to add your food scraps the second time. So right before you add the new food scraps, take the temperature of your pile and see where it's at, and see if it's hitting those temperatures between 104 and 102, or 104 and 122. If it's not hitting those temperatures, it's completely fine. What that can tell you is that you either have to add more moisture. That means that you didn't have enough greens in your initial mix. You might have to add more airflow, so you might have to add more brown materials that are bulky, or you may just need to increase the size of your pile. Sometimes the pile can get super hot. It can get above 140 degrees. If that happens, what will occur with your microorganisms or the living things that are in there, they'll just go dormant until the pile cools down. So it shouldn't be a problem. Now we have poll question number 3 here. If Alan, will you put it up? So in your experience, have you had any issues with odors or unwanted visitors to your compost bin? I think, Alan, did we get a lot of responses in it so far? You can stop it. So Some people are unsure, and it looks really close to yes and no. So the next part of our presentation is going to go over just kind of best management practices to make sure that you don't experience any issues, and that when you're setting up the bin and when you're actually managing the bin, if at any point in time you are experiencing any pests or problems, please, again, reach out to us. I will troubleshoot and help you figure out what is going on and make sure we get you back on track. So one way to deal with making sure that you don't get any pests is finding the best placement for your bin. So you want to make sure that you are finding a level, well-drained space in from any property line. To make sure that you're just not on, on your neighbor's property, and you just want to make sure that it's as level as possible. I had some questions, people asking me whether or not it should go into the sun or whether or not it should go into the shade. I would say whatever you want to do is fine. Whether it's in the sun or the shade is not going to speed up decomposition. Since we are going into the winter months, you may want to have your compost bin in a place that's full sun, because if you're adding materials, if you're working in the bin, you may want to get some of that solar radiation for yourself to keep yourself warm as you are managing your compost pile. And then if you are not concerned about that, you can always put it into the shade, and it'll be very helpful for you in the summer when it's very hot outside. You don't want to be by your pile. You have a nice shady area for you to work in. You're going to want to place your compost bin at least 2 to 3 feet away from all other walls and structures. The reason being is that you want the area to be as clean as possible to prevent any animals like mice or rats or anything like that from being able to kind of scope out and live behind your bins. And by having the structure a little bit farther away, if you can't do 2 to 3 feet because your space is limited in your backyard, try to aim for at least 1 foot, or for you to be able to get behind your bin so you can do any weeding of any plants that might be back there and just cleaning up the general back area of the compost bin. You want to keep the area around the compost bin free from clutter and tall growing plants. This is all best practices for making sure that you don't have any mice or rodents entering into your compost pile or causing you any issues with your compost pile. Rats, if you've had issues with them in the past, are animals that like to stay really close to walls. So, and they want to be in shady, low light areas. So by keeping the bin away from a wall, by keeping the area clean and free of tall growing plants, you're making it less likely for them to want to live there, and more likely that if they are living there, that they can be seen by predators that are in the neighborhood, like hawks or coyotes, that could potentially eat it. So these are just best management practices when setting up your bin. And then as we're going into the winter months, you may not have other garden trimmings that you can use as browns. So I would recommend, if you don't have one already, setting up a separate pile for just your brown materials. So this person here in this photo has just a wire mesh with leaves inside of it. And then they can use that throughout the winter to mix with their food scraps as they're putting it into their bin. You can also pick up a geo bin from us, from one of the locations that we provide geo bins to, and that could be your brown storage, so that you can have a space for your leaves that you can use that as a way to store browns, so you can put it into your food scraps when you add the food scraps little by little. So this is a very bad example of a bad bin placement. So as you can see, everything is really tall growing. The bins are really close together. Not only that, there's a lot of other plants around. This makes it really difficult just to manage your bin, but on top of that, this makes it a really nice habitat for other organisms that you may not want to be around, for instance, rats or mice or anything like that. So just make sure that you're following kind of those rough guidelines that we provided when you're placing your bin, or sorry, so that way you can prevent any pest or problems that you may potentially have when you have crowded bin space. So let's go into best management practices for a stationary bin. So for those of you who got a stationary bin, you folks got this lovely bin that's on the bottom. It's called the Earth Machine. I love this bin. I've worked with it for over 12 years. It's fantastic. It's super simple. It makes everyone's life simple. And it has a really big capacity, which makes it easy to compost food scraps. So we're going to choose a bin that has a lid. You don't have to worry about that. You already have a bin that has a lid. You want to make sure that lid stays on. And with the Earth Machine, it's a locking lid. So it's very helpful to make sure that lid is locked after you add the food scraps and you've done all manage your bin. You're going to add that piece of 1/2 inch hardware gauge that we gave you, and you're put it onto the ground, and then you're going to make sure that hardware cloth extends about 4 to 5 inches all around. So I fielded some questions for folks this week about what to do with that. So what to do with the hardware cloth. So what you can see in this photo here on the right hand side is it's for the base of your compost bin. You don't need to have your compost bin elevated like this person has in this photo here. You can have the hardware cloth or the hardware cloth right onto the ground, and then add your Earth Machine on top, the static bin on top, and that's completely fine. With the exposed hardware cloth that you have, you can add wood chips, or now that we're going into the leaf dropping season, you can add a layer of leaves all around that exposed hardware cloth. So that way your feet are not getting like tangled up in the hardware cloth that's there. And then you're going to always cover any exposed food scraps that you added to your bin with at least 3 to 4 inches of brown materials. And then and this is a recommended practice, but you don't have to do this. Turn your pile frequently every 1 to 2 weeks. Like I said, it will speed up the decomposition process. But if you have back issues, if you're like, that's a lot of work, I don't want to do that. If you put the right mix in and you're covering your food scraps, and you don't want to turn it, it's completely fine. You may get to a point where you're running out of capacity for your bin, and we can always talk to me, but that shouldn't happen for a while. So for instance, this Earth Machine that we provided to you can take up to about 200 to 280 food scraps before it hits capacity. For some of you, you may hit that sooner rather than later. And then for others, it may take you a very long time to hit that capacity. So you have enough space in that Earth Machine to keep adding food scraps for a relatively long time without turning your pile if you feel like that's just an unnecessary step. So exposed food scraps, one takeaway from this, is going to cause problems. So on the left-hand side are exposed food scraps, and as you can see, they're all things that we would recommend you adding to your bin. There's pumpkin and potato peelings and some leeks, and looks like some cabbage back there. What will happen is if it's exposed, not only will you attract things like fruit flies and other types of flies, but you can attract the lovely image of this right next to it, which is the black soldier fly. Black soldier flies are really great decomposers. Don't get me wrong, but if you don't want to have your bin looking like this, then I would recommend that you add those 3 to 4 inches of browns on top, so that way the black soldier fly larvae aren't as numerous in your compost pile. What will happen if you have a lot of black soldier fly larvae in your pile is that they produce a substance called frass, and that will cause your bin to become low oxygen and anaerobic, and it can cause problems later on. But they can eat things very quickly, and you'll see your materials go very fast if that's what you want to do. But the majority of people I know don't really like looking at those black soldier fly larvae. So what are some best practices for tumblers? For those of you who have tumblers out there, they are great, but you have to manage them in a specific way, so that way you can make sure that you can keep on tumbling the bin because it can get too heavy if you add too much materials in it. So tumblers work best when we're talking about batch composting, and batch composting is when you save all your browns and greens and then add everything into it at the same time. So that may not work for some of you, but that's a great way to make sure you don't overfill your tumbler and make it too heavy. If you want to add materials into your tumbler little by little, that's fine. But what I would say is after, once you get it full once, stop adding materials to one side of the bin and then go into that second chamber and add materials only into that second chamber. After a few weeks, about 1 to 4 weeks, the first side of the bin or of the tumbler will have decomposed drastically, and then you can start adding more materials into there. If you do decide to do batch composting, I had said this earlier, but greens can be saved in the containers and put into the fridge or freezer, so that way you can add everything at the same time into the bin. And then you're still going to be using the same ratio of browns to greens. So you're going to add your browns and green material into a tumbler with that 2-to-1 ratio. So 2 buckets of browns to 1 bucket of greens. And that is, we're toward the end of our presentation, which we're right on time, which is fantastic, but I'm sure we have a bunch of questions. These are additional resources. Like I said, this PowerPoint will be made available to you, so you can access all of these links. And this is my contact information. A lot of you already have it, so please email me if you have any questions. So Alan, let's answer any questions that people have in the next 5 minutes, and then any questions that we don't answer, like I said, we'll follow up via email.
So Kathy, I think what we'll do, several questions came in regarding the actual using of the materials. A couple of comments came in that someone may not have received the thermometer with the delivery. So if anyone has any issues that they didn't receive something, let Kathy know and she will follow up. So a question came up around the compost thermometers. It has 2 dials on it. So how do you use the compost thermometers?
Oh yeah, great. Let me just go back to the. Yeah, so it has. So if it has 2 dials on it, you're looking at the Fahrenheit. So we want all of our data in Fahrenheit. And I believe from my understanding, you folks all got the Rio temp. Hopefully that's the right one. I don't think you got a different one. If you did get a different one, I'll get back to you. I'll talk to our contractor to make sure. But you should just be using the one dial that's looking at the Fahrenheit temperature.
Okay. You mentioned the hardware cloth is some comments come in regarding what's the purpose of the hardware cloth.
Yes. Okay. So the purpose of the hardware cloth is to help keep organisms like anything that's tunneling or burrowing animals, so moles, voles, mice, rats, from going up into your bin. The hardware cloth that we provided for you is galvanized steel, so it takes a very long time for it to rust, and it's also really difficult for those types of rodents to break through the half-inch gauze by chewing through it. So it's just another measure in terms of best management practices to make sure that you don't get any rodents inside your bin from underneath.
Okay. A question regarding fruit flies, the compost pail inside the house. If you're collecting the food scraps inside, how do you avoid invasion of fruit flies? And how would you get rid of them if you have them? So
2 ways to deal with fruit flies if you may potentially get them. One is you can store your fruits and vegetables in the freezer. All you have to do, and if you don't have excessive space in the freezer, if you just freeze the fruit scraps once and then pull them out, it will kill all of the larvae that's on the food scraps, so you don't have to keep on adding it into the freezer. If you do get fruit flies, you want to make sure that you're storing your food scraps into a container in the house that has a lid. That's why I was suggesting things that have lids, like the 5-gallon bin or a yogurt container, because that'll help mitigate fruit flies from going everywhere. If you do get fruit flies, one of the best things to trap them is doing an apple cider vinegar trap, and we can send along that information to you folks, so that way if you do get them, that's the best way to kind of trap them and get them out of your kitchen area.
Kathy, when you have a tumbler and you you fill up one chamber and then you go to the second one, when do you actually remove the compost from the chambers?
Yeah, so for the chamber, so what you're gonna want to remove it is when things look completely done. So you're waiting for it to look like rich compost. So it's going to be dark, soft, crumbly material, soil-like texture. If you need more capacity, one of the things that you can do is you can take out the material from the first chamber and just put it into, after it's been in there for a while and you don't see any exposed food scraps, and then you can just add that into your geobin, and it'll keep on decomposing and then turn into completely finished compost.
Okay. Measuring the moisture content of your pot for the data sheets, can you just do a visual as opposed to putting your hand in it?
Yes, you can totally do a visual as opposed to putting your hand in it. If you look at the data sheet, it just says too wet, too dry. So if you're adding materials in and it looks really wet, you just write too wet. And then it's just more of a way for you to, as a visual reminder of like what you should be doing. If things are too wet, you should be adding more brown.
And along the lines of the data sheet, what is the purpose of the data sheets for the project?
Yes, so for us on our end, we're going to be collating that information. We want to make sure, one is that you're keeping track of how to, you're keeping track of, the stuff that you're adding into the bin. We want to make sure that the bins are the right size for our community. So we're testing to see how much actual food scraps can you add into those bins. By having all of you as participants in this residential project, we can get a good estimate of how much actual food waste these bins can handle. And then additionally, if we need to look at different types of bins, we can do that if we need smaller bins or larger bins to handle the food waste that our Montgomery County residents are producing at home. The temperature and all of that other stuff helps us when you provide it back to us, because I can look at it and then say, okay, this person is having issues with it being too wet or too dry. I can reach out to you and make sure that you have access to the information, and we can troubleshoot any problems that you have.
And Kathy, regarding the weighing of the material, so you're only weighing the food scraps and not the brown materials. That was a question came up a few times.
Yes, you are only weighing the food scraps, not the brown materials. We're trying to figure out how much each of the households in Montgomery County, how much food waste y'all are producing.
A quick question came up regarding the commercial food scraps program. They're allowing folks to put in dairy, meat, and fish products into the commercial food scraps.
Yes, so for commercial food scraps and our new single family pilot of food scraps that are getting picked up, those are going to large scale facilities that can handle materials that are like meats and dairy. Because of the small capacity of a lot of these materials, a lot of compost bins, adding meats and dairy and fish can cause, and probably and most likely will cause, problems because you are working at such a small scale. The materials that get picked up at the commercial side and the materials that get picked up in our single family pilot are going to really big facilities that can handle those materials. They're getting aerated, they're getting turned on a more frequent basis, and they have all these additional precautions to make sure that no pests or vectors are becoming a problem at those facilities.
And one, I guess, last question going back to materials, shredded paper that came up a few times. Is shredded paper considered a brown material?
You can add shredded paper, but what I would suggest is shredded paper is probably best to put into your curbside recycling. Shredded paper, depending on what type of paper it is, can have emulsifiers or binding agents in it that can make your compost bin really gummy and won't really break down as well in your compost bin. Is that all the questions, Alan, for now?
Yeah, I think that's a little
okay.
after 8, so.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everybody, for staying on with us. I hope that you got some really good information from this presentation. Like I said, I will email everybody the slides and then additionally the link to our survey. Please provide us
It was in the chat.
Okay,
I
great.
just posted in chat, yep.
Great. Please provide, give us any feedback about the presentation and any items that, any feedback about any items that we've already given to you will be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.